Shocking escape, how 10 inmates broke out of a U.S. jail undetected for hours, the vanishing act. If you think you've seen crazy prison breaks before, think again. Like, comment, and subscribe, because what happened inside Orleans Parish Prison will make you question how anyone ever escaped this place. It was 2:17 a.m. when the first alarm should have gone off. But it didn't. The cameras were still rolling, the guards still drinking coffee, and 10 inmates, 10 men with nothing left to lose, were already halfway through the wall. The night was thick with the kind of silence only prisons know. A silence made of whispers, footsteps, and secrets. Inside cell block C, a rusty toilet had been loosened weeks before. The bolts were gone, the wall behind it cracked like old bone. And behind that wall? A narrow crawl space that led straight into the skeleton of the prison. A forgotten maintenance tunnel no one had checked in years. No one really knew who started it. Some said it was Marcus Slim Delroy, the one with a knack for plumbing and a lifetime sentence for armed robbery. Others said it was Louis Crane, quiet, brilliant, the kind of man who could turn a toothbrush into a key. But by the time the warden would piece it together, 10 names would be missing from the roster, and the biggest jail escape in Louisiana history would already be hours old. At 3:05 a.m., a guard named Preston noticed something strange. The usual shouting had stopped. The block was too quiet. He walked down the hall, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Cell 312, empty. The toilet ripped from the wall. A hole just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Jesus, he muttered, stepping closer. Cold air rushed out like breath from the dead. By the time he hit the panic button, the escapees were already outside. They'd crawled through the tunnels into the utility shaft, and up a rusted ladder that led to a forgotten maintenance hatch. Beyond that, a chain-link fence topped with dull barbed wire. But these men were desperate. They threw their prison-issue sheets over the top and climbed. The sound of their shoes hitting the wet grass beyond the wall was like the heartbeat of freedom. And then came the impossible part, crossing Interstate 10. Under the amber glow of streetlights, the men dashed between speeding cars, their orange jumpsuits flashing like sirens in the night. A semi-truck horn blared. One nearly slipped. Another froze mid-lane. But somehow all 10 made it across, vanishing into the marshland beyond the road. When morning came, the city of New Orleans was waking up to chaos. Reporters swarmed the prison gates, helicopters cut across the sky, and Sheriff Denton Carmichael stood pale and furious before a wall of cameras. "We are conducting a full-scale manhunt," he said, his voice tight. "They won't get far." But the truth was, they already had. At 9:47 a.m., a fisherman called 911 from the edge of Bayou Savage. He'd found something tangled in the reeds, a prison uniform soaked in mud, torn at the shoulder. Near it, a broken handcuff, the metal snapped clean in half. Within hours, roadblocks were set, neighborhoods locked down, and the U.S. Marshals were called in. But for every hour that passed, the escapees' trail went colder. Inside the prison, investigators retraced their steps. How did no one hear 10 men ripping out a toilet? How did no motion detectors trigger? How did they all disappear without a single alert? That's when one deputy, combing through security logs, noticed something strange. A maintenance order from 2 weeks before the escape. It authorized a pipe repair in cell block C, signed by a staff member who didn't exist. Her name, Lisa Hartman. Maintenance ID 0047. The prison had no record of her. No photo. No employment file. Nothing. When they cross-referenced the badge number, the system glitched and crashed. By the time the IT team got it back online, a message had appeared on the internal terminal. 5 words glowing in bold white text. "We were never really locked." The deputy stared at the screen, her hands shaking as she called the warden. Because what that message meant was that someone inside had helped them. And the escape? It wasn't just a breakout, it was a blueprint. Inside job. By sunrise, the prison was crawling with investigators, and every inch of cell block C was sealed off like a crime scene. Floodlights blazed over the corridor. Officers moved in silence, stepping over concrete dust and broken bolts from the toilet that started it all. The smell of damp concrete mixed with the faint scent of bleach, the kind of odor that tried and failed to cover up the truth. Sheriff Carmichael stood by the hole in the wall, his face drained of color. He was a man used to bad news, riots, overdoses, stabbings, but this was something else. 10 inmates gone. A forged maintenance record. And a name no one could trace. Lisa Hartman, he repeated under his breath, staring at the printed badge found near the tunnel. "Who the hell are you?" Detective Naomi Ridge, the lead investigator from the Louisiana Bureau of Investigation, adjusted her gloves. "Whoever she is, Sheriff," she said quietly, "she had access. And that means she had help." They followed the tunnel route, crouching low through the narrow passage behind the toilet. The light from Naomi's flashlight cut across crude etchings in the wall, tally marks, initials, even a small arrow pointing forward. "They've been planning this for months," she said. As they reached the far end, the air grew colder. The tunnel opened into a maintenance shaft lined with corroded pipes and wires, old infrastructure untouched since Hurricane Katrina. A metal ladder led upward toward the ceiling. One of the rungs was slick with something dark. Naomi crouched down, inspecting it. "Blood," she whispered. "Fresh." "Maybe one didn't make it out," Carmichael muttered. "We'll search the marshlands again." But Naomi wasn't convinced. Or maybe someone wanted us to think that. Meanwhile, across town, the city was in panic mode. News stations ran the story on repeat. 10 inmates on the loose after daring escape. The mayor held a press conference promising swift justice. Helicopters patrolled the skies. And in the lower Ninth Ward, where the roads flooded after every storm, a local gas station attendant claimed he'd seen a group of men in orange around 5 a.m. buying food and swapping clothes from a trash bag. When officers checked the surveillance footage, something didn't add up. The faces of the supposed escapees were clear, except one man at the edge of the frame. He wore a baseball cap low over his face, and when he looked toward the camera, his features flickered like a glitch. The timestamp froze for 3 seconds, then skipped. The system had been remotely accessed. Back at the prison, Naomi met with the IT officer, who looked visibly shaken. "The internal network was breached last night," he said. "Someone disabled the camera feeds between 2 o'clock and 3:10 a.m., exactly during the escape window. Whoever did it knew the layout, the system passwords, and how to loop footage without detection." Naomi frowned. "That's not inmate-level knowledge. That's someone who's worked here." The officer hesitated. "There's something else," he said, pulling out a USB drive. "This was found plugged into the central terminal. It's been encrypted. We can't open it." She slipped it into her pocket. "We'll see what's on it." As night fell, the city turned tense. Roadblocks extended to Baton Rouge, and every abandoned shack or motel was raided. But the escapees seemed to vanish into thin air. Then at 10:32 p.m., Naomi's phone buzzed. An anonymous message appeared. "You're looking in the wrong direction." Attached was a grainy photo, a woman's ID badge. Name, Lisa Hartman. Title, Maintenance. Stamp, Orleans Parish Prison. And behind her in the photo was the sheriff's office. Naomi's eyes widened. "This photo was taken inside the administration wing," she said. "That's restricted access." Carmichael looked genuinely confused, or at least he seemed to be. "You're saying someone used my office to forge credentials?" But Naomi noticed something, a faint reflection on the glass door behind Lisa in the photo. A blurred silhouette of a man in uniform, standing just off frame. The badge number barely visible, #17A5. She turned to the warden. "Who wears badge 17A5? The warden hesitated, his lips tightening. "That's Sergeant Mitchell. He's been here 12 years. Works night shift." "Where is he now?" Naomi demanded. The room went silent. Mitchell's phone had been off since 4 a.m. His house. Empty. His car. Found abandoned near I-10, the same highway the escapees crossed. When they checked his desk in the prison office, they found a folded map of southern Louisiana, and a note written in messy black ink. "We built our own freedom." Naomi looked at the sheriff, her voice cold. "This wasn't a prison break. This was an operation. And your sergeant was the inside man." But the sheriff didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the map, at a small red circle drawn deep in the bayou. Next to it, a single word, safehouse. The bayou safehouse. The next morning, heavy mist rolled across the Louisiana wetlands, swallowing the trees and turning the landscape into a maze of shadows. The search teams were exhausted, dragging through knee-deep mud and swarms of mosquitoes. Helicopters circled above, their rotors chopping the air, but from the ground visibility was near zero. Detective Naomi Ridge stood at the edge of the swamp, staring at the red circle on the map they'd found in Sergeant Mitchell's desk. "If the circle's accurate," she said, "there's an old fish processing plant about 5 miles west. It's been abandoned since 2008. No cameras, no power, no roads in or out except by boat." Sheriff Carmichael nodded grimly. "That's where they're hiding." By noon, a small tactical team set out in airboats, weaving through narrow canals lined with cypress trees and Spanish moss. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with the sound of frogs and cicadas. Every splash felt like it could be a body moving under the surface. As they neared the coordinates, the smell of rust and salt grew stronger. The plant came into view, a massive, decaying building half submerged in the water, its walls streaked with mold and graffiti. A faded sign read Bayview Fisheries Company. The airboats drifted to a stop. The team moved quietly onto the creaking dock. Inside, the structure was a skeleton of its former self, empty conveyor belts, hanging hooks, and water dripping from broken pipes. Naomi's flashlight beam swept across the floor. She spotted footprints, 10 distinct sets, leading deeper inside. "They're here," she whispered. The team fanned out, weapons raised. They followed the trail through a corridor into a back room where an old generator still hummed faintly. A small camp had been set up, blankets, canned food, empty water jugs. Someone had been living here recently. Then Naomi froze. On the far wall, scrawled in black marker, were the words, "You'll never find all of us." At that same moment, a distant splash echoed from outside. One of the officers rushed to the dock. "Boat's gone," he yelled. "They took one of ours." Naomi bolted to the window, peering through the fog. A shadowy figure was steering the stolen airboat toward open water. She pulled out her binoculars. The figure turned slightly, and her heart sank. It was Sergeant Mitchell. He wasn't running from the escapees. He was with them. "Carmichael, he's leading them," Naomi shouted. The sheriff grabbed the radio. "All units, we have visual on Mitchell heading southeast down the bayou. Cut them off at Lake Bourne." The airboats roared to life, engines screaming through the swamp. The chase tore through narrow waterways, the spray of water hitting their faces like rain. Naomi clung to the railing as the trees blurred past. She could just make out the fugitives ahead, orange jumpsuits, some half-torn, one waving a gun in the air. "Closer," she yelled over the roar. A shot rang out, then another. Bullets tore through the air. One hit a metal pipe near Naomi's boat, sending sparks flying. She ducked low. "They're armed." Suddenly, Mitchell's boat veered sharply into a hidden canal. Naomi's team followed, crashing through reeds. The canal opened into a wide clearing, and there, half submerged, was an old barge. Smoke rose from its deck. Mitchell's group had boarded it. Naomi's heart pounded. "They planned this all along," she muttered. "The safehouse was never the end. It's their launch point." The barge's engine roared to life, pushing slowly toward open waters. Naomi's radio crackled with static as she tried to call for backup, but the signal was weak. Then an explosion. The shockwave threw everyone backward. The old fish plant behind them erupted into flames. A second blast followed, fire lighting up the fog like a sunrise of chaos. "Carmichael." Naomi coughed, pulling herself up. "They rigged the plant." The sheriff's face was pale. "They're erasing evidence." Through the smoke, Naomi saw Mitchell standing at the back of the barge, staring straight at her. Even through the fog she could see it in his eyes, defiance mixed with something else. Regret, maybe. Then the barge vanished into the mist. Hours later, all that remained was debris, twisted metal, scorched earth, and a handful of clues. The safehouse was gone. That night, Naomi sat in the command tent, replaying the last footage captured by a drone before the explosion. The barge had been carrying more than just people. There were containers, sealed and labeled with faded government markings. She zoomed in, freezing the frame. "Property of Orleans Parish Correctional Division." Her stomach turned. "This isn't just an escape," she whispered. "They're moving something." Sheriff Carmichael walked in, his tone flat. "We found something else, Ridge," he said, handing her a wet piece of paper recovered near the dock. It was another note. Scrawled in black marker, barely legible. "The wall was never meant to keep us in, it was built to hide what's inside." Naomi looked up at him. "What if this isn't about freedom?" Carmichael hesitated. "Then what is it?" She stared out into the darkness, the fire still glowing in the distance. "Cover up," she said quietly. "Something bigger than any of us." The hidden wall. The sun hadn't fully risen when the first federal black SUVs rolled into Orleans Parish. The FBI, U.S. Marshals, and a cluster of Homeland Security agents flooded the area around the burned-out fish plant. Yellow tape flapped in the damp morning breeze as investigators sifted through ash, twisted steel, and the faint stench of fuel. Detective Naomi Ridge stood off to the side, her arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, media calls, higher-ups demanding updates, anonymous tips that led nowhere. The entire country was now watching the toilet break escape, but Naomi knew something the news didn't. This wasn't just an accident. It was engineered. Sheriff Carmichael approached, a grim look in his eyes. Washington wants this contained. They're sending in a federal task force to take over. Naomi frowned. Contained? 10 inmates are still out there, Mitchell's gone rogue, and we have explosives at a federal facility. This isn't something you sweep under a rug. He sighed. They don't want to panic. Word's already spreading that one of the inmates wasn't officially on the prison roster. Naomi's gaze snapped toward him. What do you mean? Carmichael handed her a folder. Inside were booking photos, each labeled and logged, except for one. The face was partially blurred, the name redacted. No official record of arrest, no transfer papers. But he was there, Ridge. Cameras show him entering the cell block 2 days before the breakout. Naomi's heart pounded. So who was he? That's the question, Carmichael muttered. And every time I ask, someone up top tells me to drop it. As they spoke, a young deputy ran over, breathless. Detective Ridge, you need to see this. They followed him to a tent where technicians were examining melted electronics from the safehouse. One tech looked up, her gloves covered in soot. We recovered fragments of a hard drive, she said. It's heavily damaged, but the data we pulled shows surveillance footage, not from the prison but from inside it. Naomi leaned closer. The screen flickered, showing grainy black and white footage from a hidden camera. Inmates sleeping. Guards walking by. But then at 3:14 a.m. the view shifted. Someone was moving through a tunnel, narrow, concrete, lined with pipes. Then Naomi saw him, Sergeant Mitchell, leading a man in a gray jumpsuit with no ID tag. The unknown inmate turned toward the camera for half a second. His face was calm, deliberate. Not scared, not desperate. He knew he was being filmed. Naomi froze. Rewind that. Zoom in. When the image focused, her chest tightened. The man's uniform had a small patch, not orange like the others. It was navy blue. That's not a prison jumpsuit, she said quietly. That's government issue. The tech's face paled. You think he's? I don't know yet, Naomi cut in, but whoever he is, Mitchell was helping him, not the others. By afternoon, the barge's path had been traced across Lake Bourne toward a stretch of marshland near Bayou Savage. Drones picked up a heat signature, a campfire maybe. The team moved fast, boats slicing through murky water. When they arrived, they found nothing but the remains of a makeshift dock and a pile of burned documents. One sheet, half-charred, still bore a visible stamp. Orleans Parish Experimental Rehabilitation Unit, classified. Naomi felt her blood run cold. Experimental? Since when does a county jail run classified programs? Carmichael stared at the page. Maybe that's what they were hiding. Not an escape, a leak. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the tree line. The team hit the ground. Muzzle flashes burst from the shadows. Naomi rolled behind a log, pulling her pistol. Hold your fire, she shouted. A voice echoed across the swamp. You weren't supposed to find this place, detective? It was Mitchell. Naomi's heart pounded as she crawled closer. Through the mist, she could see him, clothes soaked, face gaunt, eyes wild. Behind him stood 3 of the escaped inmates, weapons trembling in their hands. Mitchell, it's over, she called. You're surrounded. The marshals are inbound. He laughed bitterly. You think this is about me? You think I wanted this? He stepped closer, lowering his gun just enough for her to see the trembling in his hands. They used those men, Naomi. Experiments, psychological conditioning, deprivation tests. I saw it. I helped hide it. Naomi's pulse quickened. What kind of tests? The kind that make monsters, he said softly. You think these men escaped? But they were released. Before she could respond, one of the inmates yelled, a flash of light, a gunshot, and Mitchell fell backward into the water. Chaos erupted. The inmates scattered into the swamp, vanishing into fog. By the time the team reached the spot, Mitchell was gone. Silence settled over the water. Naomi looked down and saw something floating beside her, a small waterproof envelope. Inside was a single SD card labeled, Unit 9 footage. She clutched it tight, whispering, You didn't die running, you died covering the truth. That night, back at headquarters, Naomi inserted the card into her laptop. The screen filled with grainy footage, guards leading blindfolded inmates through a corridor marked Restricted Access. The date stamp was from 2 months before the escape. The final clip froze her blood. A title card reading Behavioral Reprogramming, Phase 3. Then the footage cut off. Naomi sat back trembling. They were never meant to get out, she said. They were meant to disappear. Outside, thunder rolled across New Orleans, echoing like distant gunfire. And somewhere out there, in the dark bayou, the remaining 7 inmates were still free. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe before the next breakout begins.